This segment brought to you by Kansas Regenerative Medicine Center. Your stem cells, your health, your life.
The grand reunion of Forsyth Scouts kicked off at the Lincoln Museum in Lincoln, Kansas on August 24th. With 39 descendants of the 50 fearless men in attendance, it was certainly memorable. The Chalmers Smith family had the most descendants present, coming from as far as Florida and Michigan. The next day, the 8th Kansas Infantry, acting as the fort's garrison troops, raised the flag at Fort Harker, signaling the registration of the first 30 scouts. As the roll was called, each scout stood before the same desk used by Major Henry Inman 150 years earlier to the day. The man portraying Major Inman was his great-great-grandson, Dennis Bailey of Ellsworth. As each scout's name was called, the descendants stood to be recognized. Historian Mike Day observed that Scout Howard Morton's name was called, and his descendants stood up. Next up, they called Scout Henry Tucker, and his descendants stood up. And they were seated next to each other. Ironically, back in 1868, Scouts Tucker and Morton were neighbors in the Tescott area. Immediately behind Scout Tucker's descendants were the representatives of the Peet family. In 1898, Scouts Tucker and Peet, along with Chalmers Smith, went to Colorado to find Beecher Island, 30 years after the battle. The famous old Pete Henry rifle that rode with the relief column to Beecher Island was displayed courtesy of Jamie Lee Shank and family. Greg Heller, the curator of the Fort Harker Guardhouse Museum, presented throughout the day, sharing the history of the fort and welcoming the descendants and the public. After the chaplain's church services on Sunday morning, the scouts headed for Fort Hays and the enlistment of more scouts. At Fort Hays, 20 more scouts were added to the roster, and we will feature their activities next week. The commemoration moves to Fort Wallace this weekend. Friday night, September 7th, the Fort Wallace Museum will host a buffalo supper with the scouts for members of its Guardians of Fort Wallace, its friends group. To join, call or email the museum. Memberships are available at the door, but reservations should be made. Also that evening, the docudrama Thoth's Dragon will be shown. Cast and crew are also invited. A highlight of the weekend's events will be the unveiling of a lifelike sculpture of the Cheyenne warrior Roman Nose by Topeka artist Melissa Rao, with clothing by Ken Widener. An encampment of the Scouts and Buffalo Soldiers will be set up on the museum grounds. Historians presenting will be Lieutenant Colonel retired D.K. Clark, John Manette, Jerry Green, and Dave Harrington. A concert by Zerf, the Kansas Troubadour, will wrap up Saturday evening's activities. On Sunday morning, a 9 a.m. church service at the Bethany Lutheran Church on museum grounds will precede the horse-drawn procession to the old Fort Wallace Cemetery. The scouts who fell in the Battle of Beecher Island will be memorialized, as will Roman Nose and the Cheyenne Warriors. Events for the Fort Wallace Museum, September 7th through 9th, and the Beecher Island site, September 15th through 16th, are in the Mountain Time Zone. The communities and historic sites in each area have come together to create a memorable chain of events. Each site is grateful to the sponsors whose support made this commemoration possible. The Kansas Department of Wildlife Parks and Tourism, the Smoky Hill Trail Association, and Around Kansas have provided essential support. Dozens of other sponsors have supported the efforts, and they will be recognized at each site. A special shout out to the men and women portraying the Scouts. It is a huge commitment of time and resources, and without them, none of these events would be possible. Huzzah!
Fort Wallace was the fightingest fort in the West. Fossils, Indians, soldiers, scouts, wagons, trails, pioneers, stories. Discover the story of Fort Wallace and the people who served here, the people who fought here, the people who settled here. Wallace County, where the past is present.